Chapter 3 is all about our perception. So, how do we perceive and take in the world around us? So, when it comes to our perceptions, our experience of perception is based on our senses. So, what do we see, smell, touch, taste, or hear? And when we take in different perceptions from our environment, those perceptions can change when we gather new information. So think about your perceptual system as being like reasoning or trying to solve a problem because our perceptions are going to happen in conjunction with other actions. When humans process information, it is unique to them, and other people might process it differently. It's kind of like if you are in a situation where everyone sees an accident occur, but they all see it from a different vantage point. Their perceptions and their experience of that same thing could be different based on their experiences and how they chose to look at the situation. Oftentimes, people have tried to use machines or robots or technology as artificial forms of perception, and those opportunities to look at machines and alternative forms of perception have been limited because what we found through research is that machines can't do what the naked eye is able to do. So let's talk about some of those things that could play a role. So first off, we have inverse projection problem, which says that when we are referring to a task or trying to determine something about an object, it is going to fall on our retina in a specific way. That involves starting with the retinal image and then extending outward to the source of the image. Sometimes objects can be hidden or blurred, and if they are, a machine is not able to determine what's hidden or blurred, whereas your naked eye can do that. People are also able to recognize objects from different viewpoints, which is known as viewpoint invariance, whereas those high level information processing skills aren't there for a machine. So scenes can be more complex, and because of it, a machine may not be able to detect it. One of the examples that's brought forth in your book is how a machine might see a spoon in front of a baby or a young person's face and perceive it as a baseball bat. And they're two very different things. Our human perceptual system uses two types of information: environmental energy to stimulate receptors, and then also knowledge and expectations that we each individually bring to a situation. So there are two types of ways we can perceive information. We can use bottom up processing, which starts with our sensory experiences, our seeing, smelling, touching, tasting, hearing. It's based on the incoming raw data and how it registers and is sent to our brain. Top down processing is the exact opposite. This is a higher level processing that starts in the brain, and it's always based on a person's knowledge, their experience, and their expectations. So you are going to perceive an event based on what you think it should be. And when it comes to top down processing, that can influence our perception of language based on our own individual experiences with that language. If you have never learned a second language, you won't speak it, you won't understand it because you don't have any personal experience with it. Speech can also be segmented, and that could help you sort of piece together perhaps what the person could be trying to say. Transitional probabilities is knowing which sound will likely follow another. But when it comes to our ability to understand language, we can only engage in top down processing if we've actually experienced that language before. Some of our perceptions are the result of unconscious assumptions we make about the environment, things that are kind of outside of our awareness that we do, and we're really not aware of the fact that we do them. So that occurs when we use our knowledge to inform our perceptions. It has to do with when we make inferences about the world and how things should be. When it comes to perceptual organization, a long time ago, there was sort of this structural idea about how we understand perceptions, as you can see in the picture. It's the idea that our perception involved adding up sensations and looking at the dots and making sense of it. But sort of the new age or the new way of viewing perception is through Gestalt principles, which says that our mind groups patterns according to these intrinsic laws that we have for ourselves. So when we think about Gestalt principles, there are a few different principles we can talk about. There's a principle of good continuation, which says that when we see a whole bunch of lines grouped together, we can imagine that those lines are all connected because that would be something that's continuous for us in our perceptual field, especially when it comes to our prior experiences. So if, like the example in the book, you saw a rope on the beach, the principle of good continuation would say that rope is one single strand instead of a bunch of disjointed strands, which we know it could be, but that wouldn't be our initial thought. We also have the law of pragnance, and the law of pragnance says that we our brain wants to perceive an image as complete even when it's not. It's the principle of simplicity or good figure. So our brain automatically wants to fill in a figure and make it whole, such as the Olympic rings. We don't see them as, things that are separated rings, like 9 different parts. We see them as 5 rings that are all looped together. And then we also have the principle of similarity, which says that we in our mind are going to group similar things together. We might look at the red dots as, one continual line horizontally or vertically, or as a square of circles. Or, in figure B, we are going to look at the blue and red dots as separate vertical columns. Or we might look at the pattern of blue, red, blue, red, blue, red. So our perception is determined by how we organize information in our brain, not just through dark and light stimuli, but how we organize the information we're perceiving in our brain. Our experience plays a big role, and our experience can influence how we perceive something, but it's not the only way things can be perceived. There's also something called the light from above assumption, and there was a picture in your book that shows the light from above assumption, and that is when we assume light comes from above because it's common in our environment, and we perceive shadows as specific information about depth and distance. So many of the images you see online where people can't make out, where this thing is coming from or what color it is the light from above assumption. There are also some regularities of our environment that are semantic in nature. This is the meaning of a given scene, saying that it's related to what happens within the scene. These semantic regularities are the characteristics associated with functions carried out in different types of scene. There's also this idea of scene schema, and a schema is a way of viewing something. We all have different schemas in our head based on our own experience. So it's knowledge that a given scene ordinarily contains. So if we saw a scene of a classroom, we're going to automatically think it's a school and that children will be there just based on our experiences with school in the past. The Bayesian inference is the idea that you are able to estimate the probability of a given outcome um, by looking at how it's influenced by prior probability and the likelihood of a given outcome. You can see in the image some examples of that. For example, if a cough is connected to a cold or not, or if a cough is connected to lung disease and heartburn. We are able to estimate the likelihood of an outcome based on our prior probability of it and the likelihood of the given outcome. If we go back and we think about neurons, some of our neurons in our brain are going to respond best to things that occur regularly in the environment because neurons can easily become tuned in to respond best to what we commonly experience because most people have frequent experiences that are the same. So whether it's horizontals and verticals or experience dependent plasticity, those neurons sort of, fine tune themselves based on what we often experience. As observers of our environment, we can also experience what's called movement perception, and that is our perceptual changes that can occur based on when something moves. So our movement can add complexity to our perception compared to if we stayed in the same place. So the book talks about how we view, for example, this horse. If we walk around it, we can see it from different perspectives. For example, in A, it looks to be complete. It's laying there on the ground. It would look like a whole thing. But then by the time you walk all the way around to C, you can see it's very limited in its structure. The interaction of perception and action is the idea that constant coordination occurs in the brain as we perceive stimuli while also taking action towards that. So our brain is going to constantly change its perception based on us changing our actions. So when we see the cup and we reach for the cup and we grasp the cup, that is constant coordination in the brain and us taking in that information. The what and where of perception, the what path is when we determine the identity of an object. So, what is it? This happens in the ventral pathway, which is the lower part of our brain when we're trying to make out what is that thing. And the where pathway is when we determine the location of an object. That is the dorsal pathway, which is in the upper part of the brain. And as we're processing information, we always look at it from what is it and where is it coming from. So Milner and Goodell studied people with brain damage in 1995, and there were a few takeaways they had from that experience. Number one, they came up with this idea of our perception pathway, which says we perceive things from our visual cortex to our temporal lobe. And that, of course, corresponds to the what pathway. And the action pathway says that we perceive things from our visual cortex to our parietal lobe. And that corresponds with the where pathway and the how pathway. The last thing we want to discuss are mirror neurons. Mirror neurons are these neurons in our brain that respond when a person watches an action taking place. And they're called mirror neurons because when a person has a neural response, they are responding in the same way a person experiencing the action would perform. So there have been lots of functional MRI research completed that shows that there is a mirror neural system in the brain. And other research has also found that when people are engaging in real neural responses, their intention to perform the action is greater. So, a good example I always think about when I think about mirror neurons is with empathy. For example, when we hear about or we know somebody who's gone through a traumatic experience, and we empathize with them, even though we didn't go through that experience ourselves. Mirror neurons in our brain fire in similar areas that shows we do feel for that person. We feel with that person. And that's a good example of what a mirror neuron is. I hope this has been helpful in helping you understand our perceptual system and how it works.